She is a professor of education now at Stanford University and the director of their Center for Education Policy Analysis. Many of our students know her as the president or immediate past president?
Immediate past?
Great. Yes, she's so thrilled about having that behind her. Of a very important professional organization for policy folks, and that's the newly renamed Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. She actually presided over the period when the renaming occurred, which turned out to be more controversial than one might expect. She's done work in an amazing, I mean, she got her PhD, for goodness sake, in 1998. That's a year. Blink of the eye, and she already has, I don't know, dozens of publications in very important journals such as American Economic Review, I'll show my bias, as well as education policy oriented journals. So, for example, she straddled between policy and research. She, for example, headed up the massive study of the California education system called Getting Down to Facts in California, which resulted in a special issue of Education Finance Policy, which we all read in our department, and others as well. Just one, taste of her work. Her thesis, I believe, was on the centralization of school finance in Michigan. Is that correct? Which many of us remember from when they moved away from the property tax and sales tax. Very important there. She's done very important work on one paper that comes to mind is with regard to teachers' location decisions and the bias they have, if you will, towards teaching close to where they grew up, basically, and what the implications are of that. So, with no further ado, I'm sorry, I did not. There is some further ado. When she is not producing all these numerous papers that, those of us with much longer careers would envy. She's out exploring caves. She's the Amazon. I mean, so she actually told us that she really just wanted to get all these papers out so that she could actually return to her true career, which is to be Indiana Jones.
Okay, so today I'm talking about kind of an exploratory work on school leadership in effective schools. And this is most of the things. Since I turned in my thesis, I have never written a paper by myself. So, because I just don't like to. And so a lot of what I show you here will be with other people as well. Oh, whoops. Uh-oh. It's meant to the end for some. I'm just going to get back on. I think we were playing around with it at the beginning. See, technically professors as well. Okay. So, I'm going to go to it anyway, so what you know. Most of the work that I've done has been on teachers and the distribution of teachers across schools and how policies affect, particularly how you can recruit high-quality, highly effective teachers to traditionally difficult to staff schools. So I think of that as kind of the main thing I've done. What do certification requirements do? What do different kinds of ways that districts hire? What do those things do for helping schools recruit teachers that will turn out to be effective? In doing that, we found, not surprisingly for people who are in schools, that principals tend to be very strongly linked to both teacher satisfaction and their decision to stay. So this is just one example. We did basically an exit survey of teachers from New York City and asked them why they left. These are people not retiring, but early career folks. And you can see that dissatisfaction with their job was kind of the real reason that they at least claimed that they were leaving. And when you ask them about dissatisfaction, you can see a little had to do with the behavior of the kids, but the school administration, which is this one, dominated everything. Okay, I think that's as technical as I get on this thing. We also, if you think about the kinds of policies that are being debated, like accountability and school-based budgeting and charter schools. All of these principals are kind of the main actor in assuming that these policies and the theory of how they're going to work. Within a lot of the big urban districts, there's also, probably as a result of these policy approaches, been an increased attention on how to attract and prepare effective school leaders. And a lot of what we do in our little center is work with school districts around questions that they have, and the school leadership and kind of the pipeline into school leadership is one of the big things that have emerged. Yet, when we looked at the literature, there seemed to be kind of a lack of understanding of what principal qualities to look for in hiring or development, professional development. And there also, in general, in most of the districts we were in, there was a lack of an organized system for developing and recruiting leaders. It was very much kind of whoever wanted to go to the local university to get their degree would then come in and apply. So our approach in this kind of larger study, once this seemed to turn out to be something that was worth looking at and there wasn't very much out there, was fairly exploratory. We first wanted to just know what principals do. It was very, many of the people that I work with have been teachers. I've been a teacher, and you have a sense of what teachers do in their classroom, and there's some similarity across classrooms, but it's very hard to get a sense about what principals do. You as a teacher, you don't see that many principals, or you don't even see your principal that much during the day, and then you don't see very many principals. So what we wanted to know was whether there were differences in kind of the tasks carried out in schools that seem to be improving or doing a particularly good job, given the characteristics of the kids and the other kinds of things that they were facing. The second thing is, related to this, we wanted to try to understand what skills principals need to do these tasks. So how do these skills across principals vary across schools? And third, given the findings above, and you'll see I'll give you a kind of longer motivation, that in the first two we kind of found that personnel practices were important and some of these other kinds of big organizational things, so we're going to try to go into that in more detail to see whether those personnel practices really are an important part of effective schooling. At the same time, we wanted to get a sense more like what we've been doing in teacher labor markets about how principals move across schools and whether there are ways of getting highly effective principals to want to work in the most difficult to staff schools. So this was kind of our idea going into it. And today I'm going to focus on the middle one, but I'm going to give you a little bit of the first two just as motivation for it. So the data that I'm going to talk about today comes almost all from Miami-Dade County Public Schools, which is the fourth largest school district in the country. We've done similar work in Milwaukee and San Francisco and Kansas City. Kansas City, some of it and not others. It's a very interesting place to study leadership because they basically got rid of all the principals in the schools, halved the number of schools, and rehired back some. So everybody was faced with a new school, and you get to see kind of how different people try to work to transform schools. But anyway, Miami-Dade County is what we're going to talk about today. So just to give you a sense of that 1 and 2, what do principals do, and what are the kind of skills associated with those tasks that they do? We developed a list of 47 tasks that principals might do, starting from the literature was out there, and then talking to a lot of principals, and also then going into a bunch of schools around Stanford. And we developed this list of 47. I think it's at 53 now because we just went back into Miami 2 weeks ago. But this is from earlier data. We collected observational time use data. We observed each principal for 1 full day and recorded the time use on, 50 tasks every 5 minutes. And we did that in all the principals in high schools in Miami, plus 6 elementary schools, plus 6 middle schools. And then we went to Milwaukee, and we did it in all middle schools and high schools, and then we did it in all schools in San Francisco, all schools in Kansas City, which isn't on here. And just last week, we went back and did all the high schools, and then 30 each of the elementary schools and middle schools. And this is just to kind of get a sense of what they do during the day. So it's a fairly simple idea. Today, I'm going to talk about the first time we went into Miami-Dade. By the way, just interrupt if I talk too fast, or you have questions about what I'm doing. Okay, so then what we did is we linked these observations to administrative data and other survey data and interviews, just to get a sense of whether it differed in the different kinds of schools and how it was associated with schools that were improved. So started at one level and got to another level. These are some of the things they would do: classrooms observations, informally coaching teachers, using data to inform instruction. Those were some of the tasks. I'm just going to move through this quickly because this isn't the focus, this is more the motivation. So we found that they spent the most time disciplining students, supervising students, observing classrooms, really quite hands-on things. The least time on external relations, the kind of actually formally coaching teachers, using data, doing formal professional development, those kinds of things. We broke it up into different kinds of things that they could be doing. Operations and management might fall under administration. Sometimes I call operations, the dark blue that you spend the most on, administration. And that's kind of compliance forms and stuff like that you have to do, whereas management is things like hiring teachers, allocating the budget, those kinds of things. We split day-to-day instruction. I didn't want to do that. This one. Here we go. Sorry. Maybe not so technically perfect. The dark red and light red, these two are instruction, but we split instruction between day-to-day instruction, which is this, and that's things like teaching or observing in the classroom, an instructional program, which would be things like designing curriculum, designing professional development programs, thinking more broadly. And then 14 and 15, or 1454, this 14% and this 3% are relationships, 14 internal and 3% external, and then just this kind of transitional time. If you looked across 3 districts just at high schools, you can see that there's quite a bit of similarity across the districts in terms of what they were spending their time on, with administration pretty high and internal relations pretty high, and the day-to-day instruction and instructional program fairly low, and this organizational management, which will turn out to be important, at about 15% of the time. Okay, so then what we did was we linked it to data on student performance gains, because we have all the kids in the district and their test scores, teachers' assessments of the school, teacher satisfaction at the school, and parents' assessment of the school. And what we found is that organizational management was positively related to student performance, teacher assessment of school, and parent assessment of school. And none of the other ones were associated with student performance gains. There was a little positive, not very strong, between instructional program and teachers' assessment of the schools, as well as internal relations and teachers' assessment of the schools, internal relations and teacher satisfaction, and organization management and parents' assessment of the school. So this is just a brief view of what it looks like in schools, what they're doing, and our first look was that organization management seemed to matter. Oh, day-to-day instruction was not particularly positive. Okay. Then, related to that, we wanted to know what skills these reflect. So on this same list of 47 skills, we surveyed all of the principals, assistant principals, and teachers. Strangely enough, we got a high response rate, 89%, 85%, and 83%. And we asked principals how effective they felt in each of the tasks, and we asked assistant principals how effective their principal was in each of the tasks. And we identified ways that these tasks grouped together, and the ones that I showed you above came from this and not from our stacking them together. They came from kind of how principals grouped their skills. So if it seemed like the principals who were high in one thing were also high in another, that became a group. So just exploratory factor analysis, essentially. And then we did, again, link the responses. We found these 5 primary dimensions. So the ones I was talking about before, which was the instruction just came together as one. It didn't separate between day-to-day instruction and big instructional program stuff, but that's not surprising in terms of skills. But even though in time we thought it was an important distinction. Internal relations, organization management, which is this hiring, budgeting kind of thing, and then administration. And external relations. Okay, and then again, what we found is that Principals' organizational management efficacy, their feelings of effectiveness at this was the only one. It was associated with teacher satisfaction, student performance gains, and parent assessment, and none of the other domains were related to any of this. And then we used corroborating evidence from the APs. They took the same survey, but when we did a factor analysis on those, they could only identify kind of 3 separate things, which is instruction, internal relations, and this kind of operations. And again, I guess I didn't really need this, because what I did here was I took how the principal separated those tasks, and I gave it to the AP's assessment of the principal. So I took the split that the principal did, and I gave it to the AP, and it was the same thing. It was the only thing that was related to student outcomes or teacher satisfaction or parent satisfaction was this organization management. So this is just kind of motivation around why we think that some of these organization management things might matter. So we did, in addition, every time we observed a principal, we did an interview at the end of the day. And so we started asking them about different practices that they did in terms of within organization management. And one of the things to us that came out was kind of the focus on personnel and in particular. And I mean, professional development was very interesting because professional development seems to be one of the things principals have control over. So they use it for everything. They use it to reward their best teachers, to keep them. They get to go to good things. If they want to get rid of a teacher, they use professional development that they don't want to do. And if they want to improve a teacher, they think about the kind of professional development they need to improve. So the fact that they have this control of professional development in particular seemed to matter a lot. But unfortunately, I don't really know what to do with the interview data, with so much interview data, except kind of think about how it informs these other kinds of things I do. But anyway, there's a bunch of really interesting interview data that we've done a little bit with in identifying the different parts of organization management. But then if you start to think, okay, well, let's think just about the personnel part of it, there are a few different parts of good personnel practices. One of them is that you want to be able to recruit and then select particularly good teachers, right? If you think, okay, I want to have a good teaching force in my school, it's important that I not only take the best of who comes to me, but I try to get really good people to come, and then I take the best of who comes to me. That I strategically retain the best teachers that I can, so if there's some particularly good teachers, I want to be able to retain them. I want to support teachers so that they get better. And then I want to use the teaching resources that I have the best way I can. So I want to assign teachers effectively to classrooms. Okay, so this is just in theory my view of the kind of 4 things you would want to do in personnel practices. So then the question that we came up with is, does it look like schools that are effective do these things? Does this seem to be a characteristic of schools? Or is it not that they recruit particularly good teachers, but once the teachers are there, they develop a lot? Or is it not that they're any better at retaining teachers? Or do they not assign teachers any differently, but they just do some of these other things? So we wanted to go in and take a look at schools, or compare schools that were particularly effective, contingent on the students that they have, relative to other schools, and see whether we can see evidence of these kinds of things going on. And that's the paper I sent him to present today. Okay? You ready for me to start the talk? So what we're doing in this paper is we're creating measures of teacher effectiveness by comparing the test score increases of students as they move through classes. So if a student learns more in one class than they learn in another, that teacher does better in our ranking of them, our assessment of them. And we do the same thing at the school level, and then we look at some of these associations, trying to get around circularity. And I'll explain how we try to get around circularity. And that's what this Effective Schools paper is. Similar. Okay, so I have 4 research questions. I'll put them up. The first is on teacher hiring, and the question is whether more effective schools are more likely to attract more effective teachers for vacant positions. So essentially, I'm going to look at teachers who are transferring across schools, and because they were in a prior school, I can see how much their kids learned in their classes before, and I'm going to see is among those transferring teachers, controlling for all the other characteristics of the schools, whether more effective teachers funnel into more effective schools. And there's not a lot of circularity here. We measure the effectiveness of the school before that teacher comes to it, and we measure the effectiveness of the teacher before it comes to that school as well. So there's not that worry. The second question is on teacher assignment. Do more effective schools more more equitably assign teachers to classrooms? We have another paper that I actually sent in. I sent in those two first papers, one on the time use and one on the kind of self-rankings, how good they are, with this. So if anybody wants to see them, they're here somewhere. And I also sent in this one about assignment. Novice teachers in schools get, even within grade level, even within elementary schools, get more difficult kids. Lower performing kids, kids with more absences. That's just kind of across the board. And so what we wanted to say, that in my mind can't be efficient use of resources. You don't think that you want to take your least skilled teachers and give them to your kids who are lowest achieving. That just doesn't seem to be the right approach. And so we wanted to know whether more effective schools do that less. So that's the second question. And that's an easy thing to do because you could just look at kind of new teachers and see whether they have a relatively different assignment compared to other teachers in the school in the more effective school. The third one is, are more effective schools more likely to help their teachers improve over time? And this shouldn't be just a third question in a paper. You'll see we do it kind of lightly. I'd like to do it many more ways. It's not the strongest of the approaches here, but it is a very important part of what they do about personnel. So basically what we're just asking is if you take teachers who start off at the same value added, essentially, in the next year, are they more effective if they were in schools that in a prior time period we determined to be more effective schools? And then the last one is teacher turnover, which is, are more effective schools more likely to retain more effective teachers and more likely to remove less effective ones? So if you have a school and within the school you've got some good teachers and some not good teachers, do you see more of a differential attrition in the more effective schools? Okay. So to measure school effectiveness, we're going to do some equations, I think. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I can do this. So we're going to measure school by year effectiveness based on value added. So it's just basically for both. We do these all in multiple ways, and in the paper we present some of the multiple ways, but not all of them, but I will describe them. We do it separately for math and for reading, and it's the achievement of a student in a given year minus their achievement in the prior year, so their gain, is a function, I'm going to go over here, of themselves. So there's a dummy variable for each student in there, which basically says, is the gain in 1 year bigger or smaller than the gain for that student in a prior year? So how much their scores are improving. As a function, my hand shakes, so I'm not even nervous, my hand just always shake. Of the students' characteristics that are time varying. We can't put in characteristics like ethnicity or something or gender because they're always the same, but things that are varying. The classroom average characteristics of the classroom that the students are in, so their classmates' average prior score, all of those kinds of things. Their grade level, the year, and then a separate dummy variable, a separate indicator variable for each school in each year. And it is that school in each year that we're going to take as an effective school measure. We do the same thing without the student mixed effect in there. And then we do the same thing so that it just controls for the characteristics instead of, you say a similar student. How does a similar student on observable measures look? So we look at it both ways. They're very similar. And then for teachers, it's the exact same thing, except that we put school characteristics in it as well. And then we put this J by T here, which is a separate value-added measure for each teacher each year. Okay? And we do it, this way we do 3 ways. We do it with, instead of school characteristics, we put in school mixed effects. We do it, and then we do one that just controls for their characteristics. So we try to make sure that it's not, that our results aren't driven by our specifications. And that's not the big issue here. We standardize both the value addeds to have a mean of 0 and a standard deviation of 1, just so that it's easy for us to interpret the results that we're going to talk about. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these 4 questions, and I'm going to show you how I did it and show you the results, show you how I did it, show you the results. I had first done it where I went through all of them, but I realized by the end I didn't even remember what I'd done in the beginning, so I thought it was better just to do one at a time. So, do more effective schools attract more effective teacher transfers? And this is simply, is the prior value added, which is this, of a teacher, so the teacher's value added in 1 year, for a teacher that starts in school X and moves to school S. A function of the prior value added of the school they're moving to. Okay? Controlling for year and grade. So this is the basic thing, which is, do higher value added teachers move to higher value added schools? Okay? And note, because, I didn't even mention it, but I did adjust all the effects for measurement error, because there's an error. So if you can think of what a teacher effect is, it's kind of the average gain of all the kids in the class. But that's the mean of a sample, essentially, and so there's a sampling error associated with it, and all our measures are adjusted for that. We do what's called empirical Bayes shrinkage, but when it's on, you guys don't really care about this, I bet, but when it's on this side, we don't use it because you don't need to use it when it's on the left-hand side. We also checked for a whole bunch of possible mechanisms, and when I walk through this, I'll show you what those are. Okay, so here are the results. What you see on the top, if you just take math and reading, that in both cases, a 1 standard deviation increase in school value added, so if you're a 1 standard deviation increase higher in how good your school is by this measure that I told you about, the teachers that you pull in were about 15% of a standard deviation better in their prior year. And then there's the question like, okay, so what explains that? And that's what I try to do in the next 3 columns. And one is that, schools don't know what the teacher's value added is. So maybe it's just that they're hiring teachers with more experience, or they're hiring teachers who came from certain colleges or something like that. So we have these teacher controls in there, and it doesn't, I guess it brings the effects down a little, which means that that part of what they're hiring on isn't that they know exactly the value added, but they're inferring the value added from some things that we infer, like experience, and in particular experience.
Just to interrupt for a second. So are there transfer rights in these districts that you're observing? So do teachers can they decide where they go, or does the schools decide where they go?
Yeah, so it's a combination of both of those kinds of things. Transfers occur more than hires. But within the transfer pool, you get a choice. The school will get a choice.
So they must take all transfers, and then they can choose among the transfers?
Before they take new teachers. But that's a good question, and one that was going to be the big caveat, which is on this one in particular, we don't know whether this is driven by what schools do, or whether the higher value-added teachers want to move to those schools and are able to. Okay?
Is this elementary school, by the way, only that you're dealing with? I was confused from the beginning when you talked about high school principals, and now math looks like we're at the elementary school level.
Yes, so Miami actually tests kids in math and reading from grades 3 through grade 10. So we've done this separately by school type, and the results are actually surprisingly similar, but it is the whole range. Well, not the whole range. It's clearly not all teachers, because it's only math, and we can only do math and reading teachers. But in Miami, you've got a class. It's one thing they do very nicely is identify which kids are in which classes, so that even for high schools, we know who was in the English class.
You're talking about English as opposed to the reading class, or is there a reading
yes.
class?
So they're here. Yeah. So in elementary school, it's called reading. In high school, it's English language arts. The second question is whether it's something about the new school that they're coming into. So instead of just the school character, how effective the school is, we put in things like the test or levels of the schools and stuff like that that they may be selecting on. And that, again, at least in this, moves it down a little, but not too much. And then we put in controls of the school that the teacher started from. And that explains quite a bit of it, particularly in math, which to me seems that part of the school, of whether you're getting a teacher who's good, is whether you're getting them from a school that's good. Okay, so that's one way you would know whether a teacher is any good. But this is in some ways the hardest to attribute the cause to because we don't know what drives that at all. And a lot of it is clearly the teacher finding the school. We did a little bit of this in New York where we had applications to transfer and we could see who applied and then who got the job out of who applied. And so if you apply there and you're a higher value added teacher, you're more likely to get the job. And there was no preference given to, the principal had complete control over who they hired. So even though they didn't have the value added measure, they were able to figure out who had been a good teacher. And that's not that surprising because, through reputation, through interviews, through all of those kinds of things, we hope that we can get something out of those. And these aren't teachers that have never taught before. Okay, so for the second one, I'm going to ask, do more effective schools more equitably assign teachers? And what this is going to be is the characteristics of student, of the, this is the classroom composition, actually, so this isn't written quite right. Okay. Of the classroom. So, for example, the average test score of the kids in the classroom is a function of whether you're a novice teacher. So do new teachers get lower achieving kids? But then if you look over here, we do school by time, by grade, fixed effects, which means that all I'm doing is comparing teachers who teach in the same grade, in the same year, in the same school. If you're novice, do you get lower achieving kids? Okay. And then don't look. And then what I'm going to ask is whether that novice, the effective novice, is different in higher achieving schools. Okay. And it is. So the first thing you see is that on average, novice teachers get kids with prior math achievement of about 0.05 standard deviations, which doesn't seem that big, but it's actually a fairly big size. Lower scoring on average than the other teachers in their grade, in their school, in their grade, in their school in that particular year. If you look at a school that's one standard deviation more effective, that is cut in almost half. So they get kids who are 0.025. If you look at a school that's 2 standard deviations better, it pretty much eliminates the effect of being a novice teacher. So this is something that should be a school, kind of a school policy determined effect. And we don't know who makes this decision. I just have a survey that I was writing this morning where I'm hoping we're about to know. We don't know if these decisions are made by the teachers the year before or by the school leadership in terms of the assignment of teachers to classes, because that varies. But what it says is whether either of those things are going on, both of those things are kind of school decisions that appear to have this happen. And the same thing down here in reading. It's almost, the numbers in math and reading are actually very similar on this one. Okay, do teachers improve more quickly? So what we did here is we took the effectiveness of a teacher at a given time, and we controlled for his or her effectiveness the year before. And then we put in a measure of school effectiveness and indicator variables for each year of experience. So you've got, are you a first-year teacher, are you a second-year teacher? year and grade fixed effects. But basically this is asking, are teachers more effective in a given year controlling for prior effectiveness if they're in a more effective school? We do have one problem here that we wanted to correct for. So let's say we're controlling for the prior year score, and we're saying, okay, here are two teachers with the same prior year effectiveness, one in an effective school and one in a not so effective school. There's going to be some error that we've adjusted for already in the fact that it's a sample of kids. But there are other kinds of errors. For example, let's say when they're taking the math test, there's a dog barking. This is the typical example. And so the kids just don't do so well on the math test, and they're gonna look worse that year than they would have in other years. There's just some error left that we're not adjusting for. The worry is that error is correlated with whether you're a good school. So that, let's say you see two teachers that look the same, one's in a bad school and one's in a good school, and they have the same score. Well, there's probably error in the score where if they have the same score, that teacher in a bad school, probably her score is better than it should be because she should really be closer to her school. And the teacher in the good school, her score is probably lower than it should be. She should probably be she should probably be partly closer to her school. I don't know if this makes any sense, but just in general, this is a big issue when you're looking at kids who do similarly, and then it looks like they gain differentially, but they may just be kind of it's called regression to the mean. They may be moving towards the mean of their group. And so what I did, it's not the perfect way to get around it, but I used not just the teacher's prior score in math, but I did something I call instrumenting, which is I used only the overlap between their prior score in math and their prior score in reading in the prior year. And what's nice about using that overlap is the overlap doesn't have the measurement error in it, or it doesn't have the kind of dog barking measurement error problem. And you'll see it doesn't make that much of a difference, so I don't know why I went into that, but it makes a little bit of a difference. And we don't find any results for reading. That's the first kind of truth in advertising. That there is no differential gain for teachers. They don't get more better over time in reading, but they do in math, and actually pretty substantially. So one standard deviation, higher value added school, the teacher's value added goes up by about 5%. And this is with the IV just means here I used the instruments so that I tried to get away with some of that measurement error.
And that's grades 3 through 10 or whatever?
Yeah, we have, okay, so this one, the IV, no, actually that's a very good question. On these, I have the results for grades 3 through 10 for the for the basic model, and they look quite similar. For what I'm presenting here, because I wanted to have teachers who had both math and reading scores, this down here is only in elementary school. Well, so what I presented on both is only in elementary school, but I could show you the ones for this one, the top one, not in elementary school. I just can't do this kind of trick of adjusting for the measurement error outside of elementary schools. But outside of elementary schools, you see the same thing. For some reason, it's nothing in reading, but a little bit in math. Do more effective schools retain more effective teachers? So this is basically, I mean, we could walk through an equation, but I don't think we need any more of these equations. It's basically, what's the probability that a teacher will leave? Is it higher if they're more effective? Is it higher if they're in a more effective school? And is it differentially higher if they're more effective and they're in a more effective school? And that just means in general, we think that more effective teachers are less likely to leave their school. It's not that surprising. It's nicer to teach. It's nicer to do anything if you're feeling pretty good at it. And you don't see that effect. It's not a huge effect, but there is a mild I'm less likely to leave if I'm more effective. In New York we found it, here we find it. Similarly, you're probably less likely to leave a school that's operating well, right? So you would expect that. But our question is, does that particularly hold true for the more effective teachers? And I think here the results are pretty interesting. What we actually do, we do it continuously, so kind of on average, but then we also break teachers up into two groups. One, if you're kind of in the quarter% lowest in the quarter lowest teachers, so in the 25% lowest in effectiveness, and in the quarter highest, and see if there's a differential in both of those. And what's nice about that is that when I put in the continuous, it's just linear, so I don't know whether you're both more likely to keep highly effective teachers and more likely to get rid of low effective teachers. By looking at these separate groups, I can see if there's a differential for the separate groups. So I'm just going to show you the separate groups because the story's more interesting. Okay. So what this says is these are odds ratios. So it says that a teacher who is 1 standard deviation higher on value added is about 19% less likely, so 100 minus 81, 19% less likely to leave. It's also, if the school is 1 standard deviation higher value added, they're even less likely to leave. So so a higher value added teacher is less likely to leave and even more less likely in a higher value added school. It's actually easier to see down here, so let me go down here. I didn't really mean to do that. Okay, so you've got a bottom quartile teacher, which is really what's driving it. So if you are a 25% worse teacher, and in the 25% worse teachers, you're 34% more likely to leave. Okay? If you're at the top relative to the middle, there's no difference. So it's really the bottom here. If you're in the top quartile of a school, and you're average value added, you're actually a little more likely to leave. Okay, if you're average value added. But if you're a top quartile teacher in a top quartile school, you're about 43% less likely to leave. So they do a really good job of hanging on to their highly effective teachers. They don't do anything different for their low effective teachers. Their low effective teachers stay at the same rate. I guess I should have just gotten here. I feel like I talked in circles. Across these different models, which are different ways of calculating value added, you see no stars, and it's all around 1. It's very close to 1. That just means that there's not much difference depending on whether you're in a high value added or low value added school. There's not much difference on whether you leave if you're a bad teacher. But if you're a good teacher, as measured by value added, you're much less likely to leave in these high value added schools. Okay. That was I almost got that out. Yeah.
Do you know if it makes any difference whether you're looking at the high school end or the elementary end, given that you're dealing with a math teacher at the high school end as opposed to the same teacher typically in an elementary school who's teaching both math and reading, and I can't even figure out.
So this is just for math, but the results are not quite as strong, but the actual size of the results are a little bit kind of similar in reading. Reading is harder, as you probably know, to find effects in. I'm not quite sure if it's because of the tests or the way we measure it. There's evidence that this is true for both math and reading, but the results are much stronger for reading. I don't remember. I have to go back and look. We ran everything separate between elementary and middle and high, but I can't right now remember what the results are, but I should look at that. The reason that we have elementary here, but most of our other focus has been in high school, is that in most districts and most places, it's the high school principalship that's really hard to staff, right, and where the job is really, really confusing and difficult. And so that's where most of our work has been going. But this was just kind of stepping back away from those other things and saying, okay, in the data on value added, once you do that, it's harder to know the value added in the high school. So we tend to look at it in the elementary schools because it's really clean. Since Miami has high schools, we also look at the high schools. But that's a good question about how much of this is driven by math teachers in the high school, which I don't know, but I can take a look at it. Yeah.
You don't know why they left, right? Whether they were forced out or left voluntarily?
No, I don't know that. But it doesn't seem like, I mean, you wouldn't think the high quartile teachers would be forced out. I mean, you could, I guess, they'd be forced. I wouldn't think high quartile teachers would be forced out of average schools, which is what our comparison is here. You might think the low value-added teachers would be forced out, but it actually doesn't appear like they're being forced out of the high value-added schools any more than they were forced out of the low value-added schools. Okay, so I'm not checking my mail. I saw time it is. Okay, so as a paper summary, the high value-added schools attract relatively more effective teachers, and the effect size is about 0.1 to 0.15, and it could be driven either by the teachers or the schools, and I don't know which. Okay, my initial thought is that it's driven largely by the teachers on this, where teachers are looking for the more effective schools. And the reason I say this is because in our interviews, it is surprising how little recruitment that any of these schools do. Like, they very rarely go to job fairs. They very rarely have teachers give job talks, or, you know, where they teach a class or do something like that. So there's not a lot of recruitment going on, but it could be driven by the schools as well. High value-added schools more equitably assign novice teachers, and it's really about half. One standard deviation better school is about half as much of a differential between the novice and the non-novice. Teachers improve their effectiveness in math more in high value-added schools, about the effect size of 0.06 to 0.1, but it's inconsistent and really often non-existent for reading. High value-added schools retain relatively more effective math teachers as measured by math value-added, sorry, not reading value-added. And that's important because, you know, value-added is not perfect. The top quartile teachers are 30 to 40% less likely to leave top quartile schools. The caveat is that I don't really know what's going on. And so a lot of the other work we do focuses more within this black box, but this is just to as kind of an indicator that it is really a defining feature of these effective schools, that they do these things that involve getting more effective teachers in and keeping them and those kinds of things. So there is a kind of strong personnel dynamic that's going on in these schools. I just wanted to put all these up so I know what's there. That emphasize that this stuff is, as you can see, just exploratory. We're not kind of testing programs, but we are beginning to kind of talk with districts about how they would implement different kind of programs to focus more on some of these things. So, I mean, I think it's tricky. Right now, when you think about what's going on in people talking about leadership, they're talking a lot about what's called instructional leadership. And of course, instructional leadership is what you want. It's what matters is what happens in the classroom. But the problem is, in many of the districts we're going to, instructional leadership means observing teachers in the classroom. And that overall has not, in our stuff, has not turned out to be particularly useful. The only thing that it's really useful for is the principal getting information. And getting information is fine, and is like a necessary condition, but if they don't use it, which most of them don't, it doesn't do very much. And what's using that information is much more around these personnel practices. It's creating supports that match the teacher's needs, but it's also kind of looking for who's good and making sure you keep them and targeting your recruitment efforts to them. And our focus on this, the fact that it appears like the variation in organization management in these kinds of things is what's distinguishing good principals doesn't mean that's all they should be doing. It just means that most of them are doing some of these other things, spending quite a bit of time on it, And it's the relative skills and the relative focus on it that seems to be particularly telling right now in terms of which schools are improving. I think that kind of summarizes what I was saying. And one thing that in most of the districts, but certainly in Miami, that there's this same thing that you see in the unequal distribution of teachers across schools, you see that in principals too. So our least effective schools are getting the most kind of interim principals. Their principals are leaving faster. They're moving to more effective schools. The one exception to that is that some of the schools have these kind of zones, these targeted zones, where they work really hard to get good principals in. Maybe they give them a little extra pay or something. That actually seems to work. Okay, so you take a look at the ABCD schools, which is how Florida ranks them. If you get an F school, they get these resources and the district concentrates on them. The F schools' principals look better. They look more like the A schools' principals. So this is all to say that I think there are ways of influencing the dynamics that go on, but if you're just going to take the principal workforce as it is, it's very hard to think about some of these things because of this kind of unequal distribution. Okay, so that's what I had, but I'm happy to talk about any of this or any of the other kinds of things. Yeah.
I'm Bob Moranto here in the Ed Reform Department. This is great. This is really great stuff. I have two thoughts/questions. One is that there's this whole literature about how a key thing, especially in low-income communities, is discipline. And I'm kind of a fan, a lot of people are a fan of long and long. The key thing is setting up the culture early in every school year so that you're not dealing with, as a principal told me one time, if you don't have control of the halls in September, forget about it. I saw a lot, it looked like a lot of what they were doing was discipline. Did you find that they did that early on so they didn't have to later? And a second, I guess, related question, I've seen a lot in field work that very effective teachers in middle and upper income communities are very effective principals in middle and upper income communities are very different than in poor communities. And it even varies elementary, high school, but in general, poor communities, they spend more time building this with the family, building the culture. Upper income communities, they can take that for granted. They focus more on classroom instruction. Did you find that? Did you check for that stuff?
Yeah, we did look at that. I'm trying to remember. So there were a couple of parts of this. One is that we didn't look at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. We mostly had kind of early spring, winter in Miami, which is here. But we did, particularly in Kansas City, when they were all starting with a new school, we wanted to focus on that. And so we were focusing particularly on...
dysfunctional district. Yeah.
We went. Yeah, Kansas City was very nice to us. They let us go in 2 weeks before school, or 1 week before school started when the principals first got in with the teachers, and then 2 weeks into school. So we got to look at that, but to be honest, those were just entered last week. And so I don't know what the results are yet. Discipline is clearly a huge part of what the principals do. It varies a little bit in the extent to which they have vice principals or assistant principals and how much they can delegate it. We actually found, a lot of the discipline in the schools that we're in, both in Miami and in Kansas City and Milwaukee, there is a lot of violence in the schools, essentially. And so it's very hard to kind of get so you're not doing discipline during the time. But what distinguishes the principals is basically in how they use the discipline as an opportunity towards whatever goals. If you're surprised by the fact that you have discipline and it gets in the way of something you were thinking you were going to do, that by the time we've been in 500 of these schools, that didn't seem to us to be a very rational view of the world, because you know that you were going to have them in these communities. And so the trick was, how did you use them to kind of work with parents and work with kids and help define it. There is the take your hat off kind of, talk to people nicely in the hall. That was another, what we actually separated from discipline and called it more kind of what's called safe school environment, which is how you begin to create those norms. And there was a lot of belief anyway that in the reason, the basic idea of getting rid of the graffiti, because that will make things.
Greeting people by name every morning at every entrance.
Yes, at every entrance. And principles vary in that, but it is a very popular strategy to be there at the entrance. Both in Miami and in Kansas City, they put a lot of emphasis on their leadership. So I think both districts have really quite skilled people in the principalship, but it's a very hard job. And so trying to figure out how to do that job better is, I think, is interesting for them as well. Yeah.
So I'm interested in understanding better what organizational management includes, because this is the thing that really matters, right? It's influencing student learning, it's influencing teacher satisfaction, and that in turn influences whether they stay or not.
Yeah.
So, and if I understand it right, organizational management includes hiring practices. So if a teacher is dissatisfied with organizational management, they're dissatisfied with the hiring practices of the school where they've been hired. So does that mean they're unhappy about who the other teachers are? Is that what that means?
So it's actually, this isn't, the data that we used wasn't the teachers' ratings, it was the assistant principals' ratings of the principal and the principal's ratings, but it was on how good the principal was at hiring. So yes, if you're an assistant principal and you think the principal doesn't do a good job of hiring, that would be it. Now, again, this is explored.
Teachers leave because the principal does a bad job of hiring.
Yes.
So it's what they don't like then are the other teachers.
That could be it. Right. I mean, certainly that is a possibility for why this would be, is that they don't like the other teachers. But it's very much around how good your principal is at this. So. Yeah.
I'm going to pose the hypothesis that the most flawed group in the educational process is the principals. You tell me where I'm wrong, I'll be happy to change this hypothesis, because don't most principals first become teachers, and then at some point decide, for various reasons such as higher salary, get out of the classroom, give orders instead of take orders, they become principals. And they'll let you correct. And then their rationale for becoming a principal is somewhat suspect. Now, this conversation you just had, I'm an onlooker to the Fayetteville school. My spouse is in the school system. She's been at the same school for 100 years. But most of the transfers from the schools that I'm familiar with, they're running from the principal.
Yes. They
and
are.
let's just get it right out there. They're running from the principal. And oftentimes when they change principals, you can hear a sigh of relief 3 counties away at the leaving of this one person. Okay, so
Okay, so
back to
now-
my hypothesis.
Okay, so I'm
The
going to go back
reasons
to
are not good for principals to become principals in most cases. So they're flawed.
Yeah. Okay, so let me get at this.
Yeah.
So I think there's been a transition recently in some of the big urban districts that have really put emphasis on things like local control of schools and accountability and stuff like that. New York, I do a bunch of stuff in New York. They put a lot of emphasis on that. So I think it's not quite as bad as it used to be in terms of, I like to fill out forms so I become a principal. If you look at Miami, so we can take how good teachers were on their value added and then follow them into leadership positions, except for, okay, this is going to go over well here, except for the union organizers, which the kind of union leadership, which is kind of negatively or zero related to how effective they were as teachers, moving into leadership positions, instructional leadership positions like coaches, and into the assistant principal position is positively related with how good they were at student learning. So while I think part of what you're saying is right, that they may want to leave the classroom, there isn't a negative selection into the principalship right now in terms of how effective they were. And there isn't it's the coach that becomes the principal. That's not quite true anymore either. But there are lots of things that go into who becomes a principal. In the districts that we're in, race is a huge determining factor in becoming a principal. So generally, teachers are not representative of the kids in their classes. So the teaching workforce is much whiter than the kids' workforce. The principal workforce is much closer to the kids. So you had something in Milwaukee 6 times as likely to be a principal if you're black than if you're white, even though when you're coming in, when you first ask teachers when they come in, are you more likely, or are you interested, there's not much of a difference there. So I think, I mean, I think I'm getting some of this. I don't think there's a negative selection in by quality. There are other kinds of things besides how good you are at teaching, like how well you relate to the community that's going on in selection. But I think that overall, you're much less likely to get encouraged if you're female. So there's some things like that that are going on. But overall, there's just very little going on in these districts where teachers get an opportunity to either practice some kind of leadership of adults and see if they're any good at it and get better, or for the district to come in and try to find people who are good at that. So there's some informal ways of doing it that probably get some good people there, but I think the selection is not nearly as good as it could be. And so that's a big part of what's going on in some of these organizations now, is trying to figure out how to create ways that people can demonstrate leadership and you get actually good leaders in there. Yeah.
So if organizational management skills are so much more important, it seems to me, like instructional time, instructional skills, does that say anything about like the Broad Foundation or other groups that are trying to pull in business leaders or other nonprofit leaders to run schools or as superintendents?
Yeah, so, there's something like the New York City Leadership Academy, which did focus more on these kinds of stuff, and I think they are showing some kind of small positive effects. So this doesn't go in the face of all the stuff that's going on. New Leaders for New Schools also has a little bit of a focus on this. I wouldn't necessarily, what I was kind of trying to say before is I don't think it means that the instruction part isn't at all important, so that you want someone in real estate to come in and do schools, because you do, it's like any kind of organization. You want somebody who's at least familiar enough with the core technology of what's going on to be able to do it well. But it would be worth testing to see if that's true or not. I can't tell you for sure, but our results are on the margin. On the margin right now, those skills that are lacking are the organizational management skills. It doesn't mean that you don't need any of the other ones too, but everybody, all the principals were teachers, right? And for quite a number of years. So that's not surprising that those skills aren't coincidence.
But if we know that instructional leadership, the way they were defining it, is not what instructional leadership is.
Exactly.
So should that variable be called something else based on what they said it was? Because I think that's misleading. That's not instructional leadership, going around and checking teachers. So, in the research on instructional leadership and its effectiveness can be misconstrued in your findings if you keep it as instructional leadership the way they defined it, not the way you define.
Right,
not
so
the way it's defined in literature.
We don't have instructional leadership. Instructional leadership isn't one of our categories, and the reason that it's not is because I agree with you. So I think a huge part of being an instructional leader is making sure you get the people inside the class who can do the best that they can, and that you assign them effectively to classes. But that's as much, I think our point is more the definition of instructional and the implementation of instructional leadership. In many of these places really is a checklist implementation of it, which isn't really what people meant. But if I'm speaking in circles, which is what I think of the literature on instructional leadership, that it's never really clearly defined anywhere, and that's part of the problem, is that if you ask a principal what instructional leadership is, they can't say it either, right? And they often say that it's me being in the classroom. And particularly in high schools, me being in the classroom, I, as a principal, may not be the right person to help a teacher. I may want to be there so I have some basic information, but my role is to get supports in there. It's not to be the support.
But Ron Edmonds did that way back in effective school literature. That's where that thing began.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's kind of misconstrued, because people say, well, maybe instructional leadership doesn't work, but it's as they defined it, not as it really is.
Right. I completely agree that, of course, what we want is instructional leadership. It's just not what people think it is when they're implementing it in the schools right now. Yeah.
I have a question on the kind of an underlying piece of all of your questions, which is the value-added piece. And I wondered if you'd weigh in on the fun debate between sets of academics from EPI and other places who are saying value-added isn't ready for prime time, we shouldn't use it for consequential decisions because of the volatility in the measurement error, versus others who are saying it's better than not using value-added.
Yeah. Okay, so for Truth in Advertising, I was part of the Brookings report on it, so I have, I'm like midway, let's just say. We were talking about this a little at dinner. I'm not a huge fan of using value added for compensation, largely because I think compensation, it's complicated. I don't know why we focus so much on, how much someone, I think pay is one thing, but opportunities to use information in ways that can make schools better is much more important than trying to leverage things through compensation. But that's irrelevant to what you were asking me. So what do I think of value added? I think there are two possible issues. One is measurement error, that it's measured, with error, and the other is that it's biased, so that it makes some people look better than they are and some people that they look worse than they are systematically. So whole groups of people look better or worse. I think it has, definitely we know it has measurement error problems, but the measurement error problems there are certainly no worse than the measurement error problems in other measures that we have. We do a bunch with observational protocols of teachers, so my co-author on some of the New York work has designed an observational measure in middle school English language arts, and we've looked at it in relationship to value added, and at least parts of it are, have relatively strong correlations with it. So I think measurement error is, I guess all that to say is that I think there are lots of different sources of information. None of them are perfect. You've got measurement error problems, certainly in going in and observing somebody for a day. It could be a good day, it could be a bad day. You've got measurement error problems in principal's assessment of someone. The principal may judge the person based on what they're wearing instead of what they do, or something like that. But you also have biases in these other measures. So the worry in the value added is you haven't well adjusted for the characteristics of kids in the class. And I think that's a problem if you kind of systematically assign teachers students who are going through difficulties. So if you're the teacher who gets the kids whose parents are going through divorce, you're going to look bad. But the systematic assignment of lower achieving kids with their prior test score, that's not going to matter because we've adjusted for that. Observational protocols are no better in many ways on bias. You teach differently to different kids, right? So you go in and we see one group of teachers looking good, and all the kids are paying attention and it looks great. We don't really know how to separate that either. So I think my conclusion on it all is that all of these measures are biased. All of these measures have measurement error. But nonetheless, value added isn't worse than the other ones on these kinds of things and should be used in combination with it. And then how you use it in combination, either you've got that choice or you've got the choice of never differentiating anything, which is kind of where we are now. So all the evaluation systems are the same. All the teaching jobs are essentially the same. So we don't put people who are particularly good at one thing in that thing that they do well. We don't use their skills to help other people. That, I think, is a big mistake. So I like the idea of differentiation so your jobs get more, if you're better at something, you get to do more, you get more recognition for being good at it, you get more pay if you add on and do more in that area. So I like differentiation. For differentiation, you need to be able to do evaluation, and I think value added is one source of information that is as good as any other source of information, but shouldn't be used on its own. How's that?
Last question.
For circularity.
We have a lot of people. There are a lot of people who do research here in this room, and I saw some astounding things at the beginning of your presentation. I mean, you're getting thousands of teachers to fill out surveys with 89%. Against all these schools and following principals around for a day. Can you tell us how you're pulling this off? How are you getting the access? How are you collecting all of this?
Yeah. I'm very tired. We've been working hard to develop relationships with the districts, and in doing that, I do a bunch of work that they want. So while I'm interested in leadership, I have a whole bunch of different areas that I have key interests in education that I think are important, and they're interested in leadership, so I go after that. So some of it is opportunistic, and then I give them back information. So they want to know what their principals do and how it varies. San Francisco implemented this program with more pay to teach in certain schools, and also they changed their peer assistance and review process, and we went in and we interviewed tons of people and we surveyed them, and in our surveys we got some of the kinds of stuff that was helpful for my program, and at the same time got information that let them know that information was a problem. Teachers didn't know where they got what was happening, so we try to give them information that affects that or that improves their implementation. And once we do that, they kind of like us. I think that's really what it is. And our goal is to help the districts do better, both in the short run, I guess, and in the long run. And I see the research and kind of my research goals is the long run do better, but I want to, improve the implementation as well. So we try to do that.
Thank you very much for a very
Clearly, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We did a very impressive research number out there. We all look forward to doing more.
So you would have to be this year's
Thanks for coming.